Welcome back, AP. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your flipped classroom and our continuing discussion of the expansion of the Enlightenment. Thank you for this moose, Pierre. I very much appreciate it. Now, the big thing about it, though, is we left off in our last flip talking about how the Enlightenment is beginning to spread into the rest of society, right? We started talking about lending libraries, access to reading materials, the growth of salons, Pierre, right? The growth of the salons, the growth of coffee houses, how the Enlightenment is actually going to weirdly reinforce ideas of racism during this time period, and how only a handful of Enlightenment thinkers are actually going to think to get rid of all these different, really racist things. Like Denis Diderot, for example, said that slavery is really screwed up. Thanks, Denis. Wish more people said things like that, right? So the thing about it, though, is we talked about that a little bit. We talked about how Aluta Equiano's works are actually going to really come to fruition in about 1789, when we actually begin to grow this very, very small, baby abolition movement, right? But what we're going to do now is we're going to continue to talk about the expansion of the Enlightenment into the rest of European society. Now, we have to do first, before we can actually start talking about that, is we have to talk about one of the most important Enlightenment thinkers out there, right? We have to talk about none other than this man by the name of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who is one of our late Enlightenment thinkers, right? Do I not have this man's name on there? Oh my god, I don't. Wow, I'm so dumb. Anyway, let's go ahead and talk about his name real quick, okay? His name is Jean, Jean, hyphen, Jacques, Jacqueus, and then his last name is Rousseau, right? Rousseau. So Jean-Jacques Rousseau, or I call him by his SoundCloud name every now and again, or his rapper name is JJ Rose. Now the thing about it though, if he was going to come out with an album and stuff like that, if it was going to drop next week, it'd be called The Social Contract, and it'd be really impressive and stuff like that, and everybody would absolutely love it. His name would be JJ Rose Pierre. So the big thing about it though that we're talking about is we're talking about his ideas, okay? So he's one of the late Enlightenment, or one of the late Enlightenment thinkers, and if you really look into it, he's one of the most intense ones. There's another guy by the name of Immanuel Kant that we're not going to talk about, just because he's kind of just an image of oh, we should know as much as we can. Well, duh, man. So the thing about it though that we're getting into now is we're going to talk about why Rousseau is a little bit different, why he's kind of an asterisk to the entire movement, and why he's going to be such a big change maker going forward. So the number one thing about Jean-Jacques Rousseau is he kind of began to rebel against the moderation thinking of the Enlightenment. So first and foremost, so you know a little bit of background about this guy, he's not French, and he's not Scottish, and he's not English. He's actually Swiss, right? He's from the Swiss city of Geneva, the same city that John Calvin started his perfect Christian community inside of. That is actually where Jean-Jacques Rousseau is from. Now, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, growing up in Geneva, was raised by his father, who was a watchmaker and stuff like that, and he actually learned, he was very much an academic, and he learned a lot of simple skills when he was a very young guy. Geneva was also a sober community that was open to a lot of different religions and also practiced religious toleration. The thing about it that he began to notice, though, when he went to Paris later on, right? He moves to Paris, he moves to France, and he begins to observe the same stuff that so many other Enlightenment thinkers have began to observe. The opulence of French society, right? The overabundance, the amount of private property, the amount of stuff, the amount of wealth, the amount of goods. That Versailles was just this big, looming, intense palace covered in gold, right? That some of y'all will see this summer, which is super exciting. But the big thing about it, though, is he was no, the Enlightenment is going all wrong. And he thought, for example, people like Voltaire, Baron de Montesquieu, Adam Smith, David Hume, right? He thought those earlier Enlightenment thinkers weren't going far enough, fast enough. He rebelled against this idea of the Enlightenment basically being let's take what we have and make the best version of it. Jean-Jacques Rousseau was no, the version of what we have is the thing that's killing us, right? So he basically said that society needed to go backwards, right? His biggest thing that he hated was private property. You can go ahead and jot that down somewhere real quick, and which is why a lot of people actually refer to him as a proto-socialist, right? A proto-socialism, so something that you need to understand. Socialism is the idea that it heavily limits private property, or actually kind of prevents the growth of private property. And we'll talk about socialism a lot, but it doesn't really begin to grow until after the French Revolution. But the ideas of Rousseau actually inspire later socialists like Henri de Saint-Simon and Charles Fourier, right? So the thing about it, though, is he hates the idea of private property, right? He thinks private property and that human beings, ever since the creation of luxury goods and luxury items and money and monetary systems and civilization in general, has polluted naturally good human beings, right? He believes actually in kind of the idea of the human being being a naturally good thing, a naturally good living entity. That Adam and Eve were naturally good when they first showed up. That tribal societies that don't have access to all these different items and things and wealth and processed goods, he believes basically that private property and wealth corrupts the human soul, right? That it basically makes all of us think more about ourselves, and it makes us think more about our pride, and makes us look inward rather than actually looking at the community. He actually oftentimes used an image called the noble savage, right? So in some of his earliest writings, for example, A Discourse on the Origins of Human Inequality is one that he came out with 1755. He also did a discourse on arts and sciences as well, and he basically talked about how like Native Americans, before Europeans were ever introduced to them, lived in close, small-knit communities where religion was super important to them, where literally the different ideas of wealth were not a thing. Then they met the Europeans and they started to actually suicide rates increased. They started drinking alcohol, and basically the ideas of glass and gold and silver and all these other monetary things got introduced to them, and it corrupted and destroyed their society, right? So all of these ideas that he began to talk about, the limiting of private property, how we basically all need to move back out into the woods and cabins and live on our own, he really begins to outline them in one of his key works, right? And it's called The Social Contract. It's this thing that he's most famous for, right? He argued that society, the modernized society, is destroying the human race, right? But he also, in The Social Contract, said as well, basically, look, we're not all going to move out into the woods. There's no way that's going to happen, right? He actually, though, advocated for this concept, though, known as the general will, okay? The general will. Something that y'all need to do right now is highlight 100 times the general will, because that's his idea on the social contract. Not so much about the ideas of what does the government get and what do the governed get in this society. The general will is the idea that community choices are made by the people, that everything gets voted on, right? For example, if we all want soft tacos for Taco Tuesdays, we're voting on that, right? And no matter what happens, the general will of society will come to fruition, and the common good will actually take its place. So basically, it was the idea that everything should be voted on. Now, the problem with the general will is what if the entire society is racist, or what if they're angry, or what if they're upset, right? Because this kind of shows you how Nazism was the general will, in Germany during the 1930s. So that's a really big negative, right? But the idea, though, is that general will society, that basically how the society feels is the direction that it should go in, right? And so the other thing about it, he comes out with another book later on called Confessions in 1782, where he begins to rail against a lot of other things. And he also kind of confesses a lot of stuff. But the man had a lot of good ideas, right? When you actually talk about Rousseau and his really groundbreaking ideas, his idea that the regulation of private property needs to be integrated, that some people have way too much, right? That they hoard too many goods. He also came up with some ideas on the education of children as well. He talked about in one of his books called Emile, where he discussed how children need a garden and they need space to grow, and they shouldn't be wearing constrictive little baby clothes and stuff like that. They should actually be wearing big fluffy things, or being allowed to run around naked, because they're just they're babies. Let them do their thing, right? So going into it, though, also something that you need to understand. We'll talk about those good ideas as we go. He also had some terrible ideas, for example, as well, his ideas on women. He thought that women were second-class citizens, and that actually is where they needed to remain. For example, he literally had 5 daughters in his life, and he gave all 5 of them away to an orphanage because he was oh, the state can take better care of them than I can, which is ridiculous, man. You gave your 5 daughters away to an orphanage. So the thing that we need to understand about Rousseau, though, is don't worry, just like Voltaire, we're going to bring him up a ton. But the thing you're going to need to know about him for your test is his ideas on the social contract and the general will. That's his big stuff, right? And the idea also of private property and how it needs to be heavily regulated, okay? So the thing about it, though, is, like I said, don't worry, we're bringing him up a lot as we go forward. And by the way, go ahead and check Google Classroom. Sometime today or tomorrow, those flashcards that I'm making for everybody will be posted, all right? So going into it, though, something that you also need to understand is we need to talk about now the Enlightened Absolutists, right? So there are going to be 3 key rulers or key ruling families that are going to pop up during the 1700s that are going to demonstrate to us how Enlightenment ideas are beginning to eke their way into governments, right? So something that we need to understand, though, is that the Enlightenment thinkers, right, that we've talked about so far, all these guys that we talked about, right, Montesquieu, Voltaire, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, all these other different figures, all of them tend to do one big thing. They really lauded and praised and talked about one focus point. They love talking about the Glorious Revolution or the post-Glorious Revolution government of England, okay? Remember when William and Mary showed up and they ran off James, her dad, and they integrated a new system into the English government where the monarchy and the parliament had to work together, and basically this legislative body was separate from the courts of many kings and rulers, right? A lot of Enlightened Absolutists thought that the royal court of Louis XIV is the source of inequality in a lot of different ways because they have too many items and too much stuff and they live separate from the rest of society. Whereas a lot of Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire loved the English and loved their ideas of of religious tolerance and love their ideas going forward that actually we should have legislative bodies that make decisions for the people rather than leaving it up to an absolutist. Now, the thing about it, though, y'all need to understand is no matter how much the Enlightenment thinkers really love the English and that, like, kind of moderate government, but the thing about it, y'all, is, like, the idea of these other rulers throughout Europe all of a sudden just being like, oh, let's add the legislative branch, that's not realistic, right? That's not going to happen. So you got to kind of understand that the Enlightenment is only going to be achieved from like a top-down approach, right? So basically it's all going to start with the rulers and the monarchs and all that stuff at the very, very top, and then it's going to move downward, right? Into the nobles and the aristocracy, into the gentry and middle class, and then also into the peasantry. The idea that when we're looking at this of like all of a sudden the poor are just going to demand something from the bottom is very, very slim. Even when you look at the French Revolution, which we'll talk about as being a direct effect of the Enlightenment, you got to realize that it never would have happened if a bunch of nobles also didn't decide, you know what, we do need change, right? So when we're looking at this, there was a movement that happened in the 1700s where enlightened leaders popped up, right? So basically the Enlightenment ideas and Enlightenment thinkers and all their stuff had began to eke its way into that ruling class, to start moving that top-down approach. Now you can argue this as being enlightened absolutism or enlightened despotism. Now a despot or a despot is basically like a borderline tyrant, like kind of like a mean person or a bad ruler in a way. So it's like, can we have enlightened bad rulers, right? Are these enlightened rulers going to be Machiavellian? Are they going to be thinking about being feared and loved and all these other things as well? Are they going to help all the poorer classes? Are they going to help themselves? Really, really quickly, what are we really looking at? By the way, if you want to be able to watch something else about these people and talk a little bit more about them, I'm going to drop a couple of videos down in the bottom so you can actually watch these things over the weekend just going into it, right? Increase the speed, watch them a little bit. But one's a crash course video from John Green. The other one is an Enlightenment video, Enlightened Absolutist video from Heilmer. And the other one is also, of course, Political Thought and Theory by the School of Life on Rousseau. So getting into it, something that you need to understand, though, is he adopted these, or like they're going to like begin to like kind of grow these ideas, right? And there's ideas of progress and rationalism gets integrated in, and religious tolerance becomes a really big thing as well, coming from Voltaire, but not really for the peasants, right? So something that we need to understand, that's why sometimes these people are often referred to as enlightened despots, because they didn't really actually work for the poor. They kind of just made themselves look like they were nicer, right? So starting off, we're going to start off with this guy named Frederick II of Prussia, right? He is a Hohenzollern, right? Remember, you need to know about the Prussians for this test, right? The Prussians are that group that's over there into the eastern half of the Holy Roman Empire, right? They're those really militaristic folks, and what you need to understand about him, though, Frederick has a couple of really, really great, like, nicknames. He's also known as Frederick der Gross, which in, like, Frederick der Gross means in German, Frederick the Great, and also der Alte Fritz is what a lot of people called him, as in the old Fritz, right? Because he was a little bit of an older guy, and he wore this, like, really, really awesome hat and stuff like that. But looking at this as well, Frederick II, Hohenzollern, is going to be a very, very important leader because he is the son of Frederick I, that guy known as the Soldier King, right? That Soldier King, Prussian militaristic leader, his son is going to be known as Frederick the Great, right? And he's also known as this because he's going to bring Prussia from being somewhat powerful to even more powerful and basically putting them on the map as a legitimate European force going forward, okay? So big things about it, first and foremost, to start off with, is more than anything else, he's going to actually double the population of Prussia. He's going to invade some different territories, and he's going to grow the landmass that is Prussia, okay? So he doubles it by when he invades an area called Silesia, okay? In Austria, there's this like little area to the bottom of Prussia in 1740 that he invades, and he actually takes away from the Austrian Habsburgs. Now, this is a really big thing. It was called the War of Austrian Succession, and so we'll talk about that a little bit later on in the next unit and stuff like that, how basically Prussia is becoming a very large militaristic powerhouse going forward. But also, though, is he's going to welcome religious outcasts, right? So just like the Dutch did, allowing religious people or people of different religions and Protestantism to come into their community, he is going to do the same thing, and the Prussian leaders are going to allow like religious outcasts as well. Whether you be Protestant or Catholic or worship whatever you want, he doesn't really care as long as you aid to the growth of Prussia. Now, he's also going to aid to the growth of Prussia and create a 200,000 large standing army as well. Now, looking at this map of Prussia real quick, you can tell really fast as well, he's going to add an area known as West Prussia in 1772 in the outbreak of the 7 Years' War, and this area down here is that area of Austria he invaded known as Silesia. So Prussia used to be this little area and this dark purple over here. He actually connects the two of them together to create create more of a contiguous like kingdom inside of Europe, but he's got some of these little like principalities over here as well. Prussia will become very, very important as we go forward, and they become super important in the 1800s when they actually create the country that you know of as modern-day Germany. Now, an interesting thing about old Fritz, though, is he listened to the ideas of the Enlightenment thinkers, and the Enlightenment thinkers began to talk about how the peasantry of Europe was so downtrodden. So one thing he's going to do is he's going to free all of the serfs that worked on his land, right? All of the serfs that actually worked on his land were allowed to be freed. He also stored grain for famine insurance. He expanded the educational system, allowing the publishing of scientific and academic findings. There we go. We got an absolutist supporting the scientific revolution. He's going to patron famous philosophes as well. And he even abolished torture for prisons, or for prisoners. He literally paid Voltaire to come and live at his home with him and do large expansive amounts of research, and then also created a vast library inside of his home as well. So as you can tell, he's all about growing some intellectual value, and he advocated for this thing known as cameralism, right? Cameralism is his version of a new absolutist government. Not a Hobbesian one, but more of a Voltairean style of absolutism. He believed that the idea of the monarchy is the best form of government, and that's something that Voltaire believed in as well. Because remember, Voltaire was all about the strong protecting the weak, right? And so basically, the Fritz, after talking and living with Voltaire for a little while, he adopts this idea, and he's like, I'm going to be the strong monarch that helps its people, right? And he turns the monarchy into this thing where he has to use all of his resources for public good. So the taxes go directly to the monarchy, and that the monarchy should do everything in its power to help for the public good, right? He also forced nobles to serve in the army, or they had to be a civil servant of some kind, basically slowly creating a style of legislative branch that would exist inside of his country. Here's him and Voltaire literally walking through the hallways of the palace inside of Prussia, and this is him as well introducing the potato to the peasants of Prussia. This is really big because the potato is so easy to grow, and it's full of calories, and it actually is going to be something that their peasants could use to stay healthy and happy and alive, right? So the thing about it, though, is here's his despotism stuff, right? In the background of all of these great things Der Alte Fritz, or Frederick the Great, is doing, he's doing some pretty sketch stuff as well. He reinforced noble power over their serfs, right? He basically said that if your serfs try to run away and stuff like that, you can hunt them down, right? Which is a very, very aggressive thing. He also gave nobles the ability to have their serfs arrested or actually have their contracts renegotiated, making it so their contracts couldn't be renegotiated and things like that. The other thing about it, too, is he restricted commoners' access to many positions within the government. So is he really that great, or was he really just great for society as a whole without really thinking of the poor and downtrodden, right? So the other one that we're going to talk about really quick is a famous one that some of you may have heard of, known as Catherine the Great, who was the ruler and empress of Russia. Now, ironically enough, Catherine, not actually from Russia. So yeah, she's actually Prussian, funny little thing. And her name's not actually even Catherine. It's like Sophie, I think. It's like Sophie or Sophia or Isabella or something like that. Let's look that up real fast. Catherine the Great, real name. The Great, real name. So, she was actually born with a different name. And, what was her name when she was actually born? Let's see if we can find it real quick. Her birth name was, oh, yeah, Sophie. That's what I thought it was. So, yeah, literally, so her name was actually Sophie. And now, look, big thing about it, though, is she gets married off into the Russian royal family at a very young age. So, something you need to understand is she did begin her life as a German princess. Her mother was actually a cousin to the famous family of the Romanovs. So, she had some Russian lineage. She gets married off, though, eventually, okay, to the Russian royal family, and she has to move. So, she ends up, getting there, and she marries her husband, known as Peter III, right? Now, Peter III, though, was not a nice guy, right? Peter III was super rude, and he actually did not care about his people very much at all. It was still on the wall and on the books in Russia that women weren't necessarily, that it was not important for women to learn how to read or to receive an education. Whereas Catherine, Catherine actually believed that women should know how to write and should learn the works of Rousseau and read the works of Descartes and understand the world around them, right? And so they disagreed on these things heavily. Now, Catherine the Great also, though, is going to dedicate her life to the people of Russia. She is going to literally spend hours and hours every single night trying her best to learn Russian. She apparently would walk the halls of the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, constantly trying to practice her Russian, speaking it to the portraits on the walls. And apparently twice she got pneumonia because she didn't put socks on and stuff like that and got too cold in the night while she was practicing her Russian, right? Also, what's going to end up happening as well is her husband, Peter III, was at war at one point with Der Alte Fritz or with Frederick the Great that was over there in Prussia, right? Was at a small war with him during the 7 Years' War, and he just ends the war, and Russia ended up losing a lot of these different like lands and properties. Now this made the army really upset, and it made the people of Russia really upset. And Catherine the Great realized in this moment, this is my chance to overthrow him. And this alienated the army, so she actually was like literally cheating on her husband with this guy named Gregory Orlov, who was a military officer, actually talked to him and his brothers, all of the military officers, and they overthrew and arrested Peter, and this made Catherine the Great the Empress of Russia. But the interesting thing is that the people of Russia welcomed this because a lot of them viewed Peter III to be very weak and a very inept ruler, right? So the thing about it is she then ascended the throne as the sole leader of Russia, and she never got married again after that, so she could retain the power as the Empress of Russia. She was also, though, like I said, a student of the Enlightenment, right? She continued to westernize Russia just like Peter the Great had done before her. She was a very big Voltaire fan. She read many of his works. She built a series of canals through St. Petersburg. When I say canals, I mean one really big canal, but she still tried, right? She also published the Encyclopedia by Diderot after France banned it. She also moved the entirety of Diderot's library into her like winter palace and was like, look, if you ever need to use it, come on in. She patroned Diderot to do more and more work, and she built one of the largest collections of European art you've ever seen, which is now, today in Russia, known as the Hermitage Museum. It's all of her collections of European art. She also instituted a lot of domestic reforms. She wanted to boost the education system to make it actually include women as well. She wanted to create schools for women so they could become literate and actually learn the works of the Enlightenment thinkers. She wanted to limit and reduce torture to almost nothing. She wanted to increase religious tolerance. The problem with, though, is everybody was always asking her a big question. Well, what about the serfs, right? What about the serfs and the peasants? Are they allowed to be in these like schools? Are they going to be a part of this new economy? Are they going to be a part of this new system? And she had always talked about ending serfdom. It was always on her mind that she thought that the poor and downtrodden were in the need of the help of an enlightened ruler as much as possible. Problem was that was cut short by a very large rebellion. There was this guy named Emelian Pugachev who was actually a Cossack, and he claimed that he was Peter III, her husband that had died in prison and stuff like that. And ironically enough, he led a huge band of like serfs against her in a huge rebellion. This is Emelian right there, and this is him with all of the Cossacks and stuff like that. That's Emelian actually signing a document right there. And they actually this forced her to actually increase noble power over their serfs as well, rather than freeing them. She apparently ended up giving serfs away as gifts, which is like giving slaves away to other people, which is absolutely wild. That's a part of her despotism, right? She also expanded and modernized a lot of different things by improving infrastructure systems like roads and roadways, ironically enough, so she could collect taxes more efficiently. She also pushed the remaining Mongols out, and she also is going to end up chopping up Poland along with Austria and Prussia a little bit later on. So yet again, when we're looking at her, she did a lot of great stuff early on, and then as we can see in the back end of this stuff down here, she's not really that good of an enlightened absolutist, right? She's Catherine the Great mostly to the nobles and to the middle class, whereas, yet again, the peasants are kind of being left out of a lot of these reforms. Now, going into it, though, as well, we got one more group of people, right? The Austrian Habsburgs, who are going to be very, very important, okay? Now, Maria Theresa is their very early on leader. Maria Theresa is going to be a very important figure that we'll talk about a lot in the next unit. And she's going to raise her two sons in the ways of the Enlightenment, right? And her two sons' names are going to be Joseph II and Leopold II. She raised them in the ways of the Enlightenment in order to help and aid people. She increased infrastructures like adding house numbers, for example, to all the houses in Austria so that people could actually have addresses that could be easily to report for taxes and collecting census information. And whenever her rulership was over and her son, Joseph II, was old enough to come into power, who looks like this right here, you could argue, really, really quickly, listen to me very carefully, you could argue that Joseph II is the best enlightened absolutist out of all of them. He did the most, right? He did so many things. He abolished the persecution of Jewish people with the Edict of Toleration. He said no longer will anyone be able to actually lash out against Jewish people in anti-Semitic outbursts, and they actually will be arrested if they do so. He abolished that and actually made integrated them more into the Austrian society. He created freedom of press as well, and he created more controls on the Catholic Church to prevent them from overarching into the government. He pushed this forward also at one point he outlawed serfdom. Y'all, Austria is considered one of the very first countries in European history to outlaw serfdom, allowing peasants to pay rent to their lords in cash, which is going to be a very large backfire though, because after Joseph II dies, Leopold actually rolls back all of his reforms, right? All of the things that Joseph did created an unstable society in Austria, And it kind of shows us a little bit, are there limits to the Enlightenment? Does it need to be a slow progression in society to get to the point where you can actually help people? Because the second that he died, Joseph II was like, oh, wait, let's bring serfdom back. Let's like that whole not allowing a Jewish persecution. I don't know about that. So when we look at this entire thing, by the way, they have that's their mom, Maria Theresa. They have a very famous sister as well, Marie Antoinette, who is their very famous sister. But the thing when we look at the Austrians, they serve as an example of the limit of the Enlightenment. Their actions were very fair and they were very good, and like all the things that Joseph II wanted to do were super positive, but they weren't well received, and the nobility lashed out against them, and a lot of them ended up getting rolled back, right? So that right there is the end of this unit. That's all the stuff you need to know for your test. The stuff about the Enlightened Absolutists will be one of your essays that you can choose to write about, okay? Now, the big thing about it, though, is we'll review that stuff on Monday morning. I'll see y'all at 7 a.m. Y'all have a great one.